I understand that the theme of this conference is Leaders of Tomorrow, which was chosen in respect to the tremendous challenges facing the world today and the need for effective global leadership in solving them. I know that over the coming days, each of you is going to be in a committee session and that you'll debate these challenges in some detail, from the rise of ISIS to rising sea levels. See what I did there? So, as you consider the direction world leaders are going to take, what will inevitably be referred to as something like crossroads of history, I think it's worth thinking about the theme of leadership, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. So I work at a legal action charity called Reprieve, and we seek to end the death penalty worldwide and end human rights abuses committed in the name of the war on terror. And these are big issues which politicians are very keen to lead on, or at least to be seen to lead on. And that's why I wanted to talk about leadership in the context of Reprieve's work, and in particular in relation to human rights abuses carried out in the name of the war on drugs, which is something, as Sophie mentioned, we're working on a lot at the moment. And there will be a workshop that Lulu, my colleague, and I will be running on Saturday that will address this issue in some more detail. I very much hope you'll attend. So, global control of illegal drugs is an issue that's particularly relevant for the United Nations today in the run-up to a special session of the UN General Assembly, which is taking place in 2016. And that's going to cover the UN's overarching approach to drug policy. And in Reprieve's opinion, such a reassessment is sorely needed, not least because of the disastrous human rights impact that the counter-narcotics strategies based on law enforcement that have been carried out over the last 25 years represent. 33 countries around the world today maintain the death penalty for drug offences. And hundreds, if not thousands, of people are executed every year on drug charges, possession or trafficking, despite international law clearly stating that the death penalty is restricted for all but the most serious crimes, which the UN Human Rights Committee has ruled on several occasions does not include drug offences. Perhaps most concerningly, the majority of executions for drug offences take place in countries whose counter-narcotics forces receive millions of dollars in UN aid, such as Iran and Pakistan. And that aid is channeled through the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime. So this is something that really needs addressing at the UN General Assembly Special Session in 2016, we think. So this is just one criticism. The death penalty for drug offences is just one criticism of the global war on drugs, on which governments around the world have spent trillions of dollars in money and achieved nothing but huge increases in drug production, consumption, addiction, drug-related crime, drug-related health issues. It's clearly not something that's working. But we at Reprieve believe the death penalty for drug offences is the sharp end of this problem, in that it disproportionately harms the vulnerable, sustains entrenched forces of crime and corruption, and ultimately entirely fails to change a costly and harmful status quo. So if ever there was an issue that required serious international leadership, we think this would be it. And gradually, such leadership is being shown. The character of that leadership is something that I think is interesting to consider in the context of the debates that you guys will be having over the next few days. First of all, I think that leadership genuinely challenges global orthodoxy. So in 2009, the UN published its political declaration on drug policy after a General Assembly special session, which noted that drugs are not harmful because they're controlled because they are harmful. Lifting the controls on drugs would reveal a state's impotence to fight organised crime or protect the health of its citizens. So that law enforcement-focused declaration was intended to set the tone for a 10-year strategy working towards the total elimination of drugs from the world. Now, even in a 10-year strategy, I think we can all agree that that's a pretty ambitious goal. And since then, the orthodoxy that that statement pretty conclusively laid out has been pretty boldly challenged by a new generation of South and Central American leaders who have refused to repeat the old lines about the emperor's beautiful new clothes and have said something needs to change. So in September 2012, the presidents of Colombia, Guatemala and Mexico declared that the UN could not keep plodding along with its kind of complacent 10-year strategy and said, we want to bring this international conference forward. Something needs to be done sooner than this. We need to look at this. And they were successful. They brought a motion to the General Assembly, and now the UN GAS will happen in 2016 rather than 2019 as was planned. So we are building to a moment where this can be properly looked at. It's no great revelation that supplier states like Colombia and Mexico and Guatemala have absorbed the harshest end of the war on drugs. But what's new, I think, and exciting is that these states are really taking the lead in reshaping this issue through international institutions like the UN. Colombia's president, Juan Santos, has acknowledged that he and South American leaders have a lot more authority to talk about this because our countries have spilled a lot of blood fighting drug traffickers, and we need to promote this discussion. And that's real leadership, and it's the kind of regional leadership that's not simply confined to the corridors of the UN. You only need to look at Uruguay's recent decriminalisation of marijuana to see South American countries genuinely showing legislative leadership on this issue as well. And it's something that's being followed even in the United States at the moment. But I think as the South American example shows, when it comes to international drug policy, global superpowers are increasingly being led rather than leading. And a new cohort of states has shown that creative, intelligent, evidence-based policy can make you just as qualified to lead internationally as a nuclear arsenal or a colonial legacy. Another demonstration of this is Denmark's principled stand against the human rights impact of Western counter-narcotics aid to states like Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Much like Mexico and Colombia, these states are at the front line of the global war on drugs, and they see firsthand the genuine human impact of law enforcement-led drug policy. Since 1979, Iran, receiving significant amounts of money from European and Western governments, has executed at least 10,000 alleged drug traffickers, 10,000, caught by the anti-narcotics police in that country, and it's hanged over 300 in the last year alone. 70 to 80% of Iranian executions were for drug offences. Many of the people hanged were women and children. Executions are often held in public, and evidence suggests that drug charges are frequently used as a pretext to persecute political dissidents. Pakistan, another state receiving huge amounts of Western counter-narcotics aid, has nearly 8,000 people on its death row. It's the largest in the world, and a large number of those are facing the death penalty for drug offences. In recent years, European governments have given millions of dollars to the United Nations Office for Drugs on Crime to both countries' counter-narcotics police, and haven't until recently started to accept responsibility for the impact that that aid had, and the fact that aid to those counter-narcotics police was naturally leading to capital convictions in those countries. But in 2013, Denmark commissioned a review of its support to Iran on this basis, and it looked at the facts, and its evaluation said that we cannot deny the donations are leading to executions, and it resolved to pull all aid from those programs. The impact of that admission, and most importantly, Denmark's leadership in publicly announcing that recognition, was undeniable. Shortly afterwards, the Irish development minister at that time, Joe Costello, announced that Ireland had taken a similar decision and said, "We have made it very clear to the UNODC that we could not be party to any funding in relation to which the death penalty is used so liberally and used almost exclusively for drug traffickers." A few months later, the United Kingdom's Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, told us at Reprieve in a letter that "I note the recent decisions by the governments of Denmark and Ireland to withdraw their contributions to UNODC projects in Iran because of their concerns around the country's use of the death penalty for drug offences. I would like to reassure you that we no longer fund UNODC programs in Iran because we have the exact same concerns." So there's a clear chain of causation observable here between Denmark's public statement coming out and saying we've made this decision, and then Ireland's, and then the United Kingdom's. And there is obviously a movement happening. And there are European countries that still fund programs in Iran, France notably. But we hope in the coming months, those countries will start to look again because of Denmark's leadership. So finally, on these points around leadership, I think it's worth recognising that big changes, like the ones that these South American nations, like the ones that Denmark have taken on, are not so large and entrenched that they're not worth addressing. And I think that's a really important point coming up to the summit in 2016. Governments and civil society groups are committing genuine resource to effecting these big changes rather than short-term compromises. An article in the Daily Mail this morning said, "Suddenly the world seems a frightening place. At such moments, we turn to our national leaders for wisdom, reassurance, and decision." I don't think that sounds unreasonable. But I think it's worth thinking about whether immediate responses and potentially knee-jerk responses to the kind of challenges we face today will be enough. It's hard to doubt that crises like the ones we see on the news require effective crisis management, but I think we also need to ask whether that constitutes real leadership in and of itself. Every day at Reprieve, we see politicians call for decisive leadership in response to major developments, whether that's a botched execution in Oklahoma or an increased terror threat level. And swift reactions from politicians are not necessarily a bad thing, but the need for perceived decisiveness has to be balanced against a willingness to make difficult long-term decisions. That's inevitably the case with drug policy, where a shift in focus will require compromise and cooperation from an international network of actors. Leadership of that nature is essentially collaborative, and it's going to seem like a long, hard slog. But I'd like to just come to a quote from the American abolitionist Theodore Parker, who himself faced his own big, long struggle. And he said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I'm sure it bends towards justice." So squinting optimists might calculate that the leadership shown by states like Mexico, Colombia and Denmark has, the image of the curve of global drug policy bending in that direction. But the arc's going to bend faster when the leadership is followed, and as others seek to lead on this issue as well, it can be bent further. And I think the kind of leadership that really genuinely takes difficult long-term decisions is something that we're seeing more and more from a much wider range of countries, and is a really optimistic thing for international policy making. So as drug policy gets even higher up the UN's agenda in the run-up to the General Assembly special session in 2016, it's our hope that this kind of leadership continues. Now, I'm sure it was all very positive stuff right before dinner, so I'm going to start to wrap things up there. But thank you all so much for your time this evening. I very much look forward to meeting you all later, and I hope that delegates will get to speak in some more detail on this and other issues in the workshop on Saturday. But best of luck for the rest of the conference. I hope you'll have a fabulous time tonight, and a wonderful 3 days. And thank you again for tonight's organisers. Wish you all the best.